this is crazy. It's supposed to be healthcare. And it was just mind-boggling. There's such a great opportunity to lead in this space.
Find a partner that meets your needs.
Put yourself in the patient's shoes.
And when patients understand, patients are happy.
Organizations that succeed in this are going to be the ones that bring in RCM.
We're always looking for chances to do better.
The problem in our industry is
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Vendor Voices episode. I'm joined today by Adam Cartabiano, Chief Growth Officer at Knowtion Health. Adam, how you doing today?
good, man. Great to be here. I appreciate you having me on.
Absolutely, man. I'm really excited for this conversation. Well, as our listeners know, we always dive right in with our Snapshot challenge, give you and your organization an opportunity to tell the world a little bit more about you. So let's do that. Are you ready?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's fire away.
All right, man. 5 minutes on the clock. Question number one, who is Knowtion Health?
Yeah, Knowtion Health really is a technology-forward revenue cycle management services organization that utilizes AI, machine learning, really to address targeted populations of our clients' AR portfolio in an effort to drive higher cash yield on those particular segments. Our goal ultimately at the end of the day is to increase cash yield and reduce AR days in the areas of revenue cycle that are often challenging and in some cases overlooked.
We like cash yield here. Question number two, who does Knowtion Health serve?
Yeah, so we serve some of the largest acute care and academic health systems in the country, as well as community and regionally based hospitals as well.
Okay, question number three, what problem is Knowtion Health solving?
I would say it's kind of three core areas. So it's recovery of lost revenue, optimization of cash collections, and frankly, discovery of net new revenue streams for hospitals and providers alike.
All right, question number four, how is Knowtion Health solving that problem?
So we're solving these problems really by combining our proprietary technology with our expertise and service delivery teams that fundamentally and holistically evaluate our clients' scope of encounters to determine the most efficient path from a resolution standpoint to drive profitable outcomes on behalf of our clients.
All right, and final question, how is Knowtion Health solving that problem differently?
Yeah, so we apply proprietary AI in LLMs or large language models that operate in a closed environment to ensure our clients' data is secure. From there, our experts then utilize their expertise to review, validate, and approve any output from those models, ultimately driving improved productivity, efficiency, and outcomes for our clients.
All right, that's the Snapshot challenge. We did it in about 2 minutes.
There you go.
Pretty easy. We're going to get much more into detail on a lot of that stuff. And in the first 2 minutes, we hit on the buzzword that has been in literally every single episode, of course, AI. So we didn't wait long to hit on that one.
For sure.
And we'll probably talk a little bit more about it. But thanks again for joining us, Adam. I'm really excited for this conversation. I think there's a couple things we're going to talk about today that are pretty specific and unique to some of the work that you're doing. So we'll definitely spend time on those topics specifically. But before we do that, can you tell the audience a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah. So I've been in revenue cycle for 22 years now. As with most people in revenue cycle, this is not the career that I chose. It chose me. And frankly, it was due to a single plane flight between Chicago and Detroit is ultimately how I ended up in rev cycle. I was actually doing manufacturing consulting for General Motors at the time. And I was on the same flight as a bunch of consultants every week that were doing some work out in the Detroit area. And naturally you become friends because you're on every Monday morning flight and then the return Thursday flight. And one of the guys I met, we became fast friends and actually we're roommates in our 20s and more fun years. But yeah, from that kind of single introduction, I migrated over into healthcare, started more on the finance side of things, and then migrated slowly into operations. And then from there, have worked on development of new products, technologies, consulting. I've done interim leadership work. But most of my career, frankly, really has been on the operational side of the equation. I've spent a lot of time within kind of the bottom part of the hospital, trying to figure out how to get claims and denials paid and overturned. I've only been doing business development now for the last 7 years. So I think a lot of the kind of the operational experience and actually being in the weeds and the detail helps me in my current role because I'm able to correlate what we're doing as a vendor to specific problems and challenges our clients are having, and more specifically, be able to tie them to very discrete P&L and balance sheet improvements. So it's really a good way to be able to correlate what we do into a vernacular and information that resonates with our clients and prospects.
We got to find a way, I think, for those who have been lifelong salespeople, to get them more operational or consultative experience. And that's saying nothing bad about sales, because I've been in 15 years in revenue cycle, right? So not quite as long as you, but pretty much none of that was in sales. And since I started my own business, you got to figure that out. And I have a new and profound appreciation for how hard sales actually is. But I also absolutely see the value and see arguably success rates higher when salespeople have operational and or consultative experience. So I'm always glad to see people like you who can kind of help thread that needle and really tie it back to the overall impact.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, it's super important because at the end of the day, right, you have expectations, they have expectations, and you make sure that you're delivering holistically on all of those expectations. What I find is that operational background, as you're kind of setting up SLAs or setting up contract clauses, is really helpful because you're speaking the same language. You're making sure that you're aligned on a certain objective, and then you're able to translate that objective actually into the contract that obviously governs the relationship. But if you don't necessarily understand what they're saying from a revenue cycle standpoint, sometimes those things get missed. And oftentimes later on in the relationship, those are the things that cause the most friction. So it's really important, I think, to have that operational background, to your point, in a sales capacity, because it allows you to really translate what the client is saying into something that's in the contract that meets their expectations. And like I said, it reduces friction over the long-term nature of the relationship.
Yeah, and clients and prospects, they can tell when you know what you're talking about. And again, for those on the sales side who have been in sales their whole life, there's still incredibly good and successful people that have found a way to learn that stuff.
Yeah.
Without actually getting paid to do it. And kudos to you. So again, nothing against that. But let's talk a little bit more about some of the work that Knowtion does. In the beginning of the Snapshot Challenge, kind of kept it broad, tech-enabled managed services. I know, having looked into Knowtion and met with you and your team before, that you guys do a lot of different things. So since Knowtion is bringing a lot of solutions to the table, I want to start this episode off a bit differently. So from your perspective, what are some of the most overlooked revenue opportunities that are sitting inside hospitals today?
Let me maybe couch that. I think sometimes when we say overlooked, they're not overlooked from the perspective that they're not important, right? They're overlooked from the perspective that they may represent a smaller population, that, a client just says, hey, I'm not going to dedicate resources to this. So when I say overlooked, I really mean areas and segments of the revenue cycle that really are just challenging to address because they're either small populations or people don't necessarily know what the value of doing a certain activity is. So that's really, I would say, where Knowtion focuses. I would say for us and what we've seen from the market, the two key areas that we have generated a lot of education and conversations with clients around is really the independent dispute resolution process, as well as interest and penalties. And really the core reason for that is the IDR process addresses a very small population of out-of-network encounters. So once again, are you going to dedicate resources or developing a brand new technology to address the workflows that are required as part of that process? Probably not, right? So what we have done is we have taken that challenge on. We have built technology to manage the workflow that's dictated by CMS, but we have also built automation. So it allows us to take a small population and really do it at scale for most of our clients and providers. And for large organizations, we're talking about a few thousand counts a year. So it's not huge, but if you're not managing those populations well, you're really not successful at the end of the day. On the interest and penalties front, that is frankly a little bit of an overlooked area. What I would say is most clients we talk to, the common refrain is we get asked about it all the time from our finance teams. But to answer that question, it's a very complex set of calculations and processes that you really need to be able to do in aggregate and at scale. And so what we once again have done is looked at the problem, figured out why it hasn't been solved historically, and then focused our energy and effort on building a technology that then supports our services team and being able to elevate claims that are subject or should be subject to the state prompt pay laws associated with interest and penalties. And those prompt pay laws obviously differ from state to state. So if you're a multi-regional healthcare system or multi-state healthcare system, there's a variety of different calculations and considerations that you have to put in place or be cognizant of in order to evaluate your claims population successfully. So really, the interest and penalties we commonly get, we know when we get paid interest, we don't know how to track it, we don't know how to monitor it, and most importantly, we don't know how to calculate it to make sure that what we are getting paid is accurate and consistent with those state prompt pay laws.
That's perfect. And I think I teed you up a little bit, right? And we talked a little beforehand. So I'm glad these are the topics you wanted to talk about, because these are absolutely the topics that I think our audience wants to be educated on, because to your point, they are overlooked. And that's not a bad word, right? And it doesn't mean that they're not important. It means that, as we all on Revenue Cycle know, y'all got 7,000 things on your plate already.
Yeah.
If this is, to your points, a smaller population, a lesser known area, a lesser known revenue opportunity, it's not glaring on your dashboards, it's not going to get the attention it deserves, which also makes it a really good potential opportunity for a vendor partner to help you with or do for you as a managed service. So these are things we're going to dive into. So hopefully for those who are listening, here 10 minutes in, if you want to learn about interest and penalties and you want to learn about the IDR and the No Surprise Act, that's where we're going to go. So
This show is brought to you by Real Partners Consulting, a free-to-provider vendor selection support company. We help healthcare providers find the right revenue cycle partners across technology, consulting, and managed services at no cost to you. If you like what you've heard from today's guest, or if you're looking for any other partner in the revenue cycle space, let us do the heavy lifting for you. Reach out to me, your host, Ryan Downs, on LinkedIn or at rdowns@realpartnersconsulting.com, and I will personally help you find the right fit. Now let's get back to the episode.
let's start with interest and penalties, because this is one thing that I really don't know many people out there doing. A few organizations are actively tracking them, pursuing them, at least in my experience and having been asking that question. They kind of just see the payments pop up on the PLBs, right? We see the, what is it, L6?
It's L6. Yeah. Well, it's,
a few other ones.
It pops up on a few different spots of the 835 itself. But yeah, it's ultimately, at the end of the day, it's the PLB segment that it flows into usually a separate line item on the general ledger that not many people are paying attention to.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's kind of hiding in plain sight at the same time. And again, just another reason that it's probably overlooked, but you want to change that. And I'm excited for that. So let's keep it simple to start.
Sure.
For those who were like, PLB, L6, what are you talking about? But even bigger, right? Interest and penalties. 101. What are we talking about?
Yeah. So all 50 states have prompt pay laws. And those laws essentially stipulate for insurance carriers that they have so many days to either pay or deny a claim. And if they don't make that payment or make that denial within that time period, the state then stipulates either an interest penalty or a penalty associated with that claim. Now, there are caveats where, if it's denied and there's follow-up, then, the provider has 30 days to do that. And then the insurance carrier has another 30 days to respond, et cetera, et cetera. But at a very high level, all states require and have on the books rules around timely payment. And if that timely payment isn't met, there is some sort of penalty associated with that. What I will say, though, and one of the caveats to this is that most commercial plans that are governed by ERISA typically do not fall under the prompt pay statutes of that state. They're obviously subject to federal law and the rules under ERISA. Unfortunately, ERISA has a prompt pay time frame, it does not have a penalty associated with it. So what we've always told clients is within what we're evaluating, there's going to be both an opportunity to go back to payers that are subject to their state's Department of Insurance rules that would be eligible under interest and penalties to go after reimbursement for those providers. But then the information on a lot of the ERISA claims is supremely important for the managed care teams. And the reason for that is it gives them a sense and magnitude of the dollars that they're potentially missing due to late payments that are paid by the insurers themselves.
ERISA. What's ERISA?
Yeah, basically it's the I don't remember the full details of the acronym itself, but it's basically
I don't either.
Yeah, it's basically
Okay, we'll look it
from
up.
the Social Security law, I think from 1972 or 1970, that basically gives certain plans, mostly obviously the self-insured plans, protections and guidelines under federal law. And obviously federal law supersedes state laws.
So the Employee Retirement Income Security Act. I put you on the
There you
spot.
go.
I didn't know it either.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's putting some guidelines and protections on the self-funded plans.
Yes, the self-insured
Right.
plan where the insurer is just the third-party administrator for that plan.
Yeah, I mean that could be a whole nother episode, Ray. I've heard you talk about that.
Yes.
Like on Ben Riegel's podcast, the OG. Shout out to Ben Riegel. When it
Yeah.
comes to revenue cycle podcasts, there's a pretty considerable difference between the self-funded and the fully funded plans, and how arguably revenue cycle teams should go about treating those and following up on those, which is something I've heard that you're discovering more and more. So you mentioned ERISA. Is there any other laws or contractual provisions here that we should be talking about that dictate these interest and penalties?
Well, at a high level, no. And I'll give you an analogy here. So if say your house was in a storm and you had all your shingles blown off your roof, right? And you called me and said, hey, I need you to go repair my roof. Well, when I create that contract with you to get that roof fixed, right? Typically in my contract, I'm going to say to you, if you don't pay your invoices on time, I'm going to charge you 1.5% interest per month until the full invoice is paid off. In most hospital settings that we have looked at and have partnered with, that language actually doesn't exist within their managed care contracts. And so typically what we see is in language at a very high level that says, interest, payments, etc., need to follow applicable state and or federal laws, right? And so what that does is it creates a scenario where those ERISA plans can actually come back and say, no, like we're subject to federal laws, we're not subject to your state law. Our feedback to most organizations is you really need to look at getting that language included as part of your managed care contract and make it subject to all benefit plan types for that particular payer, whether they're ERISA, non-ERISA, et cetera. So that way you have a mechanism within your contracts really to hold the payer's feet to the fire in terms of getting those payments paid on time. I would also argue you really also need to evaluate as part of that structure which CARC and RARC codes you will allow the payer to utilize to delay that payment. So in a lot of cases, as you know, they'll send across the CARC code for missing documentation, when in reality, all the documentation is there. And so you really need to kind of get into the weeds of saying, hey, we're going to hold you subject to this rule. That's going to not be any different than the state rule, right? You can kind of copy and paste in, but then there are stipulations that, you can't include a missing documentation denial as a means to delay the claim under this rule. And so there's a bunch of nuances and additional detail that we're trying to demonstrate to providers that, hey, if you start looking at this and negotiating this, you have a better leg to stand on if and when you go back to that payer in an effort to either improve payer behavior in terms of timeliness of payment, or to be able to capture that interest and or penalty payment if the payers don't subscribe or adhere to that mechanism within your contract.
Gotcha. Yeah, the definition of what qualifies as adjudication is what I would probably call it there. I'd be curious as you're giving that advice. Probably it sounds like maybe that's advice is still kind of in the early stages, or at least even if you're giving it, negotiations take forever, right? So I'd be curious to see what the feedback from the payers is on that, and if they're kind of willing to go to that length.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that is, and this will always be a struggle, but something that I think providers can take the lead on because it is pertinent to interest and penalties specifically, is really defining what a clean claim actually is. And so, and the reason I say that is what we see in often cases is a payer will submit an 837. The remit coming back will be a partial payment or a denial. Provider will submit additional documentation. Part of the remit that was denied gets overturned. They submit additional documentation, and the last part of the remit is finally overturned for full payment. But the key is the initial claim that was submitted, there was no void and rebill on that claim.
Mm-hmm.
So if the payer is ultimately paying it at the end of the day, that inherently means that that claim had to have been clean when initially submitted. And so when we walk people through that logic, they're like, yeah, that actually makes sense. If everything is based off a clean claim definition and you're not asking me to void and rebill or resubmit a new claim with late charges on it, right? Those scenarios make sense. But if it's the original claim that ultimately gets paid, then by the very definition, the payer is admitting that that claim had to have been clean to begin with.
Yeah, it makes sense. I'm going to do something that I never do
Okay.
and play the payer side, right? I think my rebuttal to that might be, yes, you didn't change the claim itself, but I did not have enough information to actually determine that the claim was accurate. And that's why I needed to request that information.
Yep.
And that takes time, right? So that process. So I guess that could come back though to where, okay, hey, we've agreed that cart code 16 lacks info. I'm requesting more info. We've said that extends our timeline for interest and penalties. Then, okay, then we're fine, right? As long as I use that every time I'm saying I need more information. So yeah, I think you could get there. Okay,
Yeah, I
that was
guess
gross. I don't like playing the payer.
Yeah. But the point is it's really setting up a combination of when will this be late and when will interest be owed? What terms and conditions is it subject to from a CAR code perspective? And we have to agree that what the definition of a clean claim is. And the reason I say that is if you look at most of the the prompt pay laws at a state level, all of them reference if a clean claim is submitted, it must be either paid or denied. So that's why really getting into that definition of what that is and having an agreement between payer and provider in that case, as well as what RARC and CAR codes you can use, that's supremely important to really set up a good structure to be able to hold the payers accountable.
Gotcha. Okay, so they actually use the term clean claim in a lot of these state laws.
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay. Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I've had another guest on before who, one of the things they market is clean improvement in clean claim rate. And I'm like, well, define that for me. What does clean claim actually mean? Because
Well,
I
yeah, I mean that is the problem in our industry is 10 years ago, and this, everybody was like, hey, we got to get our clean claims rate up, and everybody now is it was in the mid 80% 10 years ago. It's now probably close to 95+%, right? But over the same time period where those claim populations and the clean claim populations went up, denials also skyrocketed at the same time. So the two aren't directly proportionally related at all, right? They should be inversely related when they're proportionally related. So it doesn't make sense, to your point, like clean claim is good, but it doesn't guarantee payment. And we've seen that because of the increase in denials over the same time period that these claims were supposed to be being much more cleanly sent out the door.
Yeah, and what you really want is that quick payment.
Yes.
And you need a clean claim for it, right? So it leads you there. But yeah, the ultimate, I guess, rate, if you could, or metric, if you could, would be how often am I getting paid within a certain number of days? And again, clean claim rate is a prerequisite for that. But to your point, you could send a clean claim and still not get paid timely. And sometimes that is something that's within your control as the healthcare provider. Sometimes it's payers being payers. Yeah. We know that all too well. All right, coming back big picture, penalties and interest. Any common misconceptions or just mistakes that people have in this space?
It's not mistakes. It's a challenge. And the reason is that the current EMRs that exist out there, cannot calculate interest at a claim level. And so you really need to have a system, which is exactly what we built, that essentially builds out the entire life cycle of that claim and is able to account for any iterations of that claim over time or any iterations of the remit over time, to be able to have kind of one view of when was that claim submitted, how was it responded to by the payer, when it was paid, when it was denied. So you're really kind of creating a time-based calculation over the life cycle of the claim. And the EMRs are not built to do that, right? They're built to say, I am owed this. I don't care when it's paid. I just know that I'm owed this based on what's in the contract. So that's the gap that we set out to solve, is, like I said, it's a challenge, right? And there was no existing technology. And so that's essentially what we have built, is the ability to take in a provider's entire claims population, evaluate everything at a claim and remit level to understand the full life cycle of that claim. And then from that, we're able to grab timestamps that allow us to look in aggregate which claims should have paid interest and either didn't, or the payer paid interest below what they should have paid based on the information contained within the 837s and 835s.
Yeah, makes sense.
It sounds simple it's like, oh, interest. Like it's a simple thing. But when you actually look at the volume of, when you're analyzing 7 to 8 million claims a year, and then being able to isolate those that need to be evaluated based on the fact that they didn't pay interest on this particular piece, that's where the true challenge comes to bear.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's like the concept of, was this claim paid timely, not timely filing, but timely in terms of interest. The concept makes sense. But then, yes, it's okay. Was this specific claim, which state is it qualifying under? Is there any contractual provisions that may differ from the state or federal law?
Yep.
Does it qualify under ERISA or not? I got a dynamic date, right? That's actually kind of helping us determine when the clock stops and starts and restarts, maybe?
Yeah.
Is that
absolutely.
defined? There is a restart?
That's the challenge of, once again, going back to the clean claim definition. So it's like trying to figure out a point in time when the clean claim, if it is initially denied, like when is that clean claim submitted? Is that the second claim? Is that the third? So you have to really understand. That's what I said, like building out that life cycle is supremely important, because it may not be clean to start with, but at a certain point in time in that life cycle, it becomes clean. And that's the point at which you need to start measuring against when the payment is made.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, it's a new claim at that point. If you've changed something on it, right? It's got a new claim ID.
Yep.
Despite it being for the same encounter. So yeah, you're restarting a clock then. So yeah, certainly a lot of rules and flows going into making sure you're tracking that. And it's crazy to me to think that we essentially, or at least most organizations, to my understanding, we just trust the payers on this one. We just trust that they're paying us interest correctly, timely, when they're supposed to. And I don't know any other strategy of trusting the payer that has gone well for healthcare providers.
Well, and I'll give you a great example of this. We saw an instance where an 837 was submitted for an infusion, and then it had a variety of J codes associated with the drugs. And as in most cases this happens, the payer approved and paid for the infusion itself, but it denied all the drugs. And so it went through 3 different remits to get fully adjudicated for that single claim. And so what we saw is, on the first remit, there was interest that was paid because it was paid late. The second remit was paid late, interest. The third remit, which was the last in the series, was paid with no interest. Keep in mind, you're looking at, 10, 20, 30 cents a claim. But when you aggregate that across millions of claims, all of a sudden it becomes a fairly meaningful value to the provider.
Yeah. So in that scenario, they admitted they owed interest with proof on 2 specific J codes, and then the same timeline for the third J code, and then they just didn't pay it.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
It's all
And
these
I mean,
nuances.
did they just miss it? Is something on their end, technically speaking? Did they do it intentionally? Who knows? Fact of the matter, payment was owed, not paid, and there's really not a good way for us to track it. And that's why I'm grateful that organizations like yours are building these things. So you mentioned it might just be a couple cents here and there, but there's a bigger picture to this. So how big is this opportunity?
Yeah. So most of our clients, we see roughly 1% to 2% of their claims population that is either miscalculated on interest or interest is owed and wasn't paid. So not a huge population of encounters, but once you get to the 2%, and start aggregating it up, it also depends. So that's the volume perspective. The dollar associated with that will vary state to state. And that's solely because certain states have higher interest penalties. So certain states have upwards to 18% interest per annum.
Holy cow.
Yeah. 12%, 10 to 12% is typically where we see kind of the midpoint. And then there's some other states that have lower percentages than that. It also depends. Some states will say, hey, it's 45 business days to get something paid. Others will say 30 calendar days. A good example is the state of California in 25. The Medi-Cals and the HMOs were subject to a 45-day payment period, whereas all the commercial plans were subject to 30. Well, they changed the rules. So starting in 26, everybody is subject to the 30-day rule. And then we have other states like Texas, who probably has the most punitive rules in the country. Texas actually deploys a penalty payment. And so for Texas, the penalty has 3 tranches depending on how many days late it is. But the first tranche is lesser of $100K or 50% of the difference between allowed and billed charges. So you can imagine that can get pretty big pretty quick.
50% of the difference between allowed and billed charges. Why?
That is the rule that
matter?
they had set up. It was, I'll give you my theory. They wanted to create a rule that was punitive enough that the payers actually took notice and said, we actually need to focus on getting these things paid timely, because if we don't, there is a massive penalty. And just so you know, once you go out to the second tranche in terms of days late, that goes to the lesser of $200K or 100% of the delta between billed charges and allowed amount. And then the third tranche is the same as the second tranche, but then they add in an 18% interest penalty on top of it. And so what ends up happening in that environment, 50% of it gets paid to the hospital. The other 50% gets paid to the Texas insurance risk pool. But as you can imagine, the delta between basically the contractual allowance for each of these encounters in some cases can be massive. So imagine as a payer, you're like, I'm not going to pay this claim on time. And then all of a sudden a provider comes back to you and says, oh, by the way, that's $100K that you now owe me. 50 goes to the TERP and 50% or 50K goes to me. It can add up very quickly. And there is not to get into too much of the weeds here, but there was and this is actually one of the reasons we went after building a technology in this area. If you look, there was a white paper that was created around the implementation of the Texas prompt pay policy. And what you saw over the course of a 10-year period was a drop of 80% on complaints associated with prompt pay issues.
It's working.
It's working.
What they found. Yeah.
Yep.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Is that, you're right. I don't want to go too much deeper, but now you got my attention. The $100,000 penalty, or I guess it'd be lesser of, because it's usually going to be lesser of, but let's pretend it's $100,000 penalty. Is that like per instance of failure to pay timely?
Yes.
Every single account?
Yep.
Holy cow. Well, that's crazy. So I think, I was going to ask more about the challenges and why providers aren't doing this. I think we've hit it on the head already. That example right there is just for one state, tranches, even just figuring out what accounts qualify, resetting dates, and keeping up with the changes in percentages and lessers. I mean, that requires a technology in and of itself.
Yeah, it was so. It was fun when we started building it, because we literally sat down and we were writing down algebraic equations using compounding interest and those types of things. So we had to literally go do research 8th grade algebra and figure out the right equations that we were able to create, so that way we could apply those equations appropriately. Because Medicare has a compounding interest factor that most states don't. So we had to figure out, how do we create a compounding interest based on changing time frames, changing dollar amounts. So it was kind of fun. It was a lot of time, but we had to go through that process to make sure that we were getting it right.
Yeah, that's a lot of math. And when is it
Yeah.
compounding, right? And tracking each one independently. Yeah, a lot of data, a lot of math. I'm picturing like the web of process flows, probably
Yeah,
pretty
we
incredible.
we definitely nerded out over it for something trying to figure it out.
As a self-proclaimed revenue cycle geek, I'm all in on nerding out.
Oh yeah.
So I do want to switch over to no surprise, Zach, and
Yep.
IDR as you mentioned at the beginning too. But before that, despite everything we just said, the level of challenges, there's going to be some providers out there that are wanting to tackle this on their own, and I wish them the best. You got any advice for them?
I would say start small. So maybe take, one of your smaller non-ERISA pairs and you can do a manual analysis of what is owed, right? So I'd start small if you wanted to do it by yourself, really I would say more of a test to determine what the opportunity potentially is for your organization. However, I would say once you start moving up into scale, like I said, it's really hard if you don't have a technology to generate a positive ROI on this, because most providers, when they are looking at interest, it's either on a single high dollar claim that they want to use interest as leverage to get that claim paid, or they introduce it if they're trying to go after a settlement over a swath of claims, they'll introduce interest and penalties as an option. But what we typically see is at the end of the day, when those negotiations happen on that settlement payment, interest and penalties is one of the things that the payers are really successful at saying, we'll pay these claims to you at the rates that you want, but we can't be also paying interest and penalties. So it's really used as like a leverage mechanism in most cases versus having it be like a continuous evaluation for revenue improvement opportunities.
Yeah, which if you're doing it systematically, you're going to be able to use it in those
Yep. And
as leverage in those conversations.
in all transparency, that's how we weren't tipped off as this being a potential revenue opportunity, but it was a direct result of doing a manual review for a particular client. And we quickly realized and looked around at the market and said, well, wait a minute, if we found this much here for this small client, where else, who else is doing this? And we started asking around and talked to a bunch of colleagues and providers and said, what would you think about this? And everybody, like I said, we know when we're paid, we can't manage it, we can't track it, we can't calculate it. And so we don't really know what the opportunity is. And so that was kind of our justification to say, okay, we think we have something here in terms of a net new idea to drive net new revenue for clients and organizations.
Yeah, it's exciting. And thank you for that advice. I think sound advice in anything new that you're tackling, start small.
Yep.
So let's shift over. No Surprises Act, Independent Dispute Resolution or IDR. There are other players out doing this as well, but I literally listened to a podcast this morning. Now we're recording in March. There's a Becker's podcast that just got released probably this morning or yesterday, and they mentioned the growth. So No Surprises Act, I think, started back in 22. Does that sound right?
January 22 is when it went into effect.
Okay.
Yeah.
And there were, they said, a couple 100,000 dispute or IDRs at that point. And in 25, it went up to a few million.
Yeah.
So it's being used. If you are a healthcare provider out there right now who is not using it, you're going to learn, I think, right now how to and why it's important you do so. But let's start again, big picture here, kind of a 101. Can you tell us what the No Surprises Act is and what's the role of the IDR process within it?
Yeah. So the No Surprises Act was really put in place to prevent surprise medical bills to patients. At a very high level, that was kind of the goal and objective of that solution. However, what ended up happening as a result of that was providers in an out-of-network setting were getting paid at out-of-network rates that were considerably lower because of the original cost shares between payer and patient. So what ended up happening is you had an expectation essentially of, say 65% of charges, even though 80% of that was due from the patient, 20% was due from the payer. Now all of a sudden you have instances where really your expectation for that encounter is like 20%. And the goal is you can't bill patients for anything higher than essentially the in-network equivalent rate. So you had these high expectations that basically got chopped in half, or even less. And so the IDR process was really a means for providers, 99% of the time they're the initiating party, but the providers to go through a formal arbitration process to really get, I would say, in-network equivalent rates for a particular service, and that rate being paid by the payer themselves. And so that's what the process was created around. To your point, I think CMS has expected something like 30,000 submissions or something very low the first year. And I think they were at 3 to 4 times that amount. And so they ran into a situation where there was a lot of backlog that the IDREs, the folks that do the arbitrations, fell really far behind.
Yeah. They see the numbers now, and I think they've been part of this podcast I listened to this morning. They've been introducing some technology to help make sure that they don't rebuild backlogs, which is it's good to hear.
Yeah, right now they had originally 13 IDREs signed up under the program to do the arbitrations, and they're now trying to dramatically expand that to be able to offset the volume increases that they're seeing. But what I would say overall, and I will try to spend the rest of my time proving this, small population of encounters, right? Similar to what we said before. But on a per encounter basis, I would argue it's the single largest revenue improvement opportunity that an organization, if they're not pursuing, is missing out on. And I will try to prove that to you over the next several minutes here.
Yeah, no, there's a tremendous amount of, I won't steal your thunder. There's a tremendous amount of numbers that are in the favor of providers.
Yep.
So it is an absolutely fantastic opportunity. But you mentioned a small population, so let's start there. What accounts actually qualify for the IDR process?
So there's 3 core definitions of what qualifies. So the first is, and I'll simplify these, but the first is a fully out-of-network event. So I live in Florida. I have insurance that isn't relevant or good anywhere else. I go to, I don't know, Virginia, and I hurt myself. I go into the ED. They obviously have to admit me or take care of me under EMTALA, and I'm out of network for that entire event. Right. And so the key piece there is A, I'm out of network. B, I've come in and my admit source was the emergency room. And that is in some cases, a common misperception. Some folks think it's only related to their emergency room patients. It's really associated with the admit source needs to be the emergency room. So that patient can matriculate to an OBS or outpatient status. They can also matriculate to an inpatient status. And that's where the big dollars tend to come into play. But it really, like you said, it really is, you have to come in through the ED. Basically, it's saying that patient had no other option to choose to go to an in-network provider. They had to come here because it was under an emergent situation.
Makes sense.
So that's one. The second element or piece, then this is frankly where most of the volume, if you look at the publicly available files under CMS, this is where most of the volume comes from, is an out-of-network charge on an in-network event. So if you think about your anesthesiologists, your ED docs in some cases, your hospitalists, pathologists, radiologists in some cases, sometimes surgical groups, or if they're out of network for that patient, those companies are typically the ones that are also submitting IDR requests for arbitration. So like the biggest private providers that are typically out of network that are submitting these are companies like Team Health, SCP. You can see, if you just Google it, you can kind of read who are the primary submitters, but most of those submitters are that fall into this particular category. And then the third category is your air ambulance for emergency cases, which obviously an air ambulance is typically always going to be an emergency case, but that is the kind of third criteria or third definition of what qualifies to be submitted through the IDR process.
At the end of the day, patient is getting out of network services, not because they chose to, because they had to.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. So that try and recap. So scenario 1, out of network event being admitted through the ED. Scenario 2, out of network services during an in-network event, for example, anesthesiologist or radiologist is out of network. You're about to get surgery. For all intents and purposes, you thought you were in network, but the anesthesiologist just happens to be out. Happens more frequently than we know. And then air ambulance. So yeah, you're not getting in an air ambulance by choice.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Got it. Awesome. Okay, that's super helpful. So let's take an account example. Walk us through that IDR workflow. So
Yeah.
start to finish.
Yeah. So let me take one step back. So there
Okay.
are certain states that are defined by CMS as what's called federal states, and there are other states called bifurcated states. And this, once again, the delineation between the two is really, for the most part, ERISA based. So in federal states, or when the NSA started, CMS basically said to states, if you want to set up your own IDR process that is controlled within your state, you can do that, but it has to follow kind of the guidelines and the rules of the federal law. So what certain states did is they said, hey, we're going to set up our own IDR process. Those accounts that are subject to the state process are the fully funded accounts that are governed by the Department of Insurance of that state. The claims that are governed by ERISA, so the self-insured populations in those bifurcated states, still follow the federal process. So that's the bifurcated state. Then you have federal states, which basically said, we're not going to create our own process and we're going to send all of our accounts through the federal CMS process. So you have to look at what state you're in to make sure that you're sending these accounts first to the right place. So that, once again, is understanding according to usually the insurance plan card or calling the payer, really understanding, is this encounter insured by a self-insured plan or a fully funded plan, especially if you're in a bifurcated state, to make sure you're sending it to the right place, because you'll get kicked out if you send it to the wrong place, right? So that's step one. Then after that, there is a very defined time frame in which you have to take certain actions according to CMS guidelines. So what really kicks off the whole process is the receipt of the remit itself. If it's denied, you still have to follow up, do the denial. It's really saying once you get the full remit paid, that's when the process officially starts. So once that remit is received, you have essentially 30 days to submit what's called an open negotiation letter. An open negotiation letter, it's a standard CMS form. There's information you have to fill out. Typically on the EOB, there will be an NSA email address that all of these forms need to be sent to. So you have to send that form in. Once you send that in within that 30-day window, that kicks off another 30-day window for the payer to respond. And so that payer can either say, hey, we're going to agree to pay you. We're going to try to meet somewhere in the middle, or they cannot pay you / ignore you. And you have 30 days to kind of go through that settlement process. You have to go through that process because you have to show proof that you went through that process in order to get to the official arbitration step. So if you skip that step up front, the arbitration organization will reject the claim because you didn't take that first step as outlined by CMS.
So real quick, Adam, on that.
Yep.
To provide, I'm taking lots of notes. Thank you.
Yeah.
If the provider during open negotiation window, are they essentially requesting a certain payment amount?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. And then if the payer just doesn't respond,
yes,
that's it. That's payer owes that.
No. So that's where you would go then officially to the arbitration process.
No, that'd be too easy.
Yeah, exactly. But so let me maybe back up here too a little bit. So typically when we evaluate organizations for opportunity, what we see is generally a 50-50 split between out-of-network payments that are 60, 70, 80, sometimes 100% of bill charges. Those aren't the ones you're going after. It's the 50% of the population that we typically are paying like 15 to 17% of charges. That's the population that we're targeting. So, and that's what that payer has submitted as saying, we view this as fair payment for this particular service. So that's called their QPA, which is the Qualified Payment Agreement. They typically will couch that QPA. What we see is usually about 100 to 115% of Medicare, right? So when we go back through the open negotiation process, really what we're trying to help organizations get is the in-network commercial equivalent rate for that same service. So as you can imagine, going from a 15 to 17% percentage of charge out of network payment to 45, 50, 55% of charges, the delta can be fairly large, especially once you get up to the inpatient environment, right? And so that open negotiation process is really a chance to kind of either come to terms with that payer or say, hey, we're not going to agree. We need to push things through the arbitration process itself.
Yeah, got it.
Yep. So then once you get to the end of the 30-day window for open negotiation, you have exactly 4 business days to submit that case to the CMS portal for arbitration. And some states differ a little bit in terms of that, but we'll talk about federal process in general. But you have 4 business days essentially to get that information submitted. That process is very time consuming because as opposed to a single letter with some very small level of information during open negotiation, once you get to the arbitration process, the degree and succinctness of your argument needs to be magnified. Because once you get to that 4-day window, you really need to bring together what we'll call demographic information around the hospital. So who are we as an organization that commands premium in-network rates for these particular services? You need to do a clinical complexity review. So you need to be able to explain, we're owed this much because of the complex nature of this case for this particular patient. You need to do a financial comparison. So you need to be able to clearly demonstrate, here's my in-network commercial rate, here's what I got paid, here's Medicare, here's Medicaid, right? For that particular service and that geographic region or hospital. So it's not just like a broad-based thing, like you actually have to have specifics. So yeah, those are kind of the core elements of the argument, but that takes time because you need somebody to evaluate the medical record, to pull out the clinical information. You need somebody to take a look. What did they pay us? Let me take a look at all the other rates that we got paid if it was like an in-network Blue Cross payment, right? So all of that stuff has to take time. And in the meantime, you're getting new ones come in because they're running out or running off of their open negotiation period. And then you need to adhere to the 4-day time period. So you can see how it gets like very complex very quickly if you don't have a great structure to manage just the workflow itself, let alone automate the information collection and aggregation that you need to do to be successful in arguing these cases. But once you get past the 4-day window or within that 4-day window, you submit everything to the CMS portal. At that point, you're given a dispute number. And then within that portal, you can select which IDRE you want to utilize for that particular arbitration, right? And there's 13, I think it's soon going to 15, but there's 13 different vendors that you can select. But the payer can reject that selection up to 3 different times, right? So I can say, I want vendor 1, the payer says no. I want vendor 2, the payer says no. You say, I want vendor 3, payer says no. 4th time, it gets automatically assigned. At that point, once it is assigned, you get confirmation of who it's assigned to. And then that's where the arbiter is collecting information, typically from the non-initiating party. So they're looking for EOBs, remits, any information that the payer has to substantiate their claims as to why what was paid was reasonable and accurate. The challenge, though, is that some IDREs view the information submitted and the calculation of the QPA different depending on which IDRE you go to. So what I mean by that is some IDREs look at things from a case rate perspective and saying just holistically based on everything that was done, what's a fair payment for this particular course of care, right? You have other IDREs that say, no, we want to look at every single CPT, HCPCS, DRG code to come up with our fair assessment of what should have been paid for this. So even the submission and the criteria in which you're either successful or unsuccessful changes by IDRE. The other challenging fact is that the IDREs don't have an objective way to evaluate each claim on its own merit. So I would say in aggregate. So for example, I could have 2 exact claims for the exact same service, 2 different patients. The first, and I submit the exact same information. The first claim could be won and the second claim could be lost because there's no real standard way in which all the IDREs are evaluating these encounters. So
it's like you're getting a different judge.
Without a doubt. Yeah. And so that's why it's super important that when you're going through this process, you have consistency in your argument and frankly, meeting with the IDREs to understand what they view as a successful argument is super important because they will tell you, hey, we look at this, and this, and then you can take that information back and build that into your process. And that's what we've done, except we've taken another level and said, we need to build a purpose-built technology to be able to encapsulate all this insight and feedback from the IDREs, so that way when we're submitting things, we have a high confidence level that they're going to be arbitrated in our favor. So getting back to the process, once the IDRE kind of goes through their process, they make a determination. That determination is legally binding. And then under federal rules, the payer typically has 30 days from that arbitration determination, if they lose, to pay that claim. And so the other thing to note too, in order to be part of the IDR arbitration process, not open negotiation, but just the process with the IDREs, there are also fees associated with it. So people aren't just kind of willy-nilly sending a bunch of stuff in, but they're actually committing some investment to it. The unique thing is, though, is that if you lose in the arbitration process, you are also subject to loss fees. So the loser pays the fees. It's the IDRE fee, essentially. The loser pays those fees. So as you can imagine, in where we're at as an industry, what we're seeing is that providers are winning on average about 85% of the time, right? And when they're winning at 322 to 350% of the QPA. So essentially 3 to 3.5 times Medicare, right? Which is a really,
my favorite part.
Yeah, which is a really, really cool rate. And that's not Adam saying that. There's obviously literature online with case studies on this. But if you think about it, from 22 to 24, there was over $2 billion that was paid back to providers because of this process. And then the cool thing is that we're starting to see on the back end is once you get, and keep in mind, your out-of-network populations are usually very narrow, right? It's not like every payer in the book. It's usually a narrow set. Once you start successfully winning against those payers, there's 3 things that we see happen. One, they start paying higher on future initial remits for out-of-network claims because they don't want to be taken through the arbitration process because of the fees associated with it and time on their end. 2, they start to offer better rates in open negotiation or become a lot more amenable to partnering to figure out what the good rate is. And then 3, which is something that we didn't expect, but we've seen it now twice, is the payers actually come back to the table to want to go back in network. So what we're
makes sense.
Is material impact on payer behavior, which is great for the provider. And we've in some cases worked ourselves out of a job because the major payer went back in network, which is great for the organization. They're not paying out of network anymore, so the IDR process doesn't apply.
Yeah, that's a wealth of knowledge, Adam. I appreciate it. This might be my favorite thing in revenue cycle right now as we sit in March of 2026 because the win rate is crazy high. The amount that's paid is crazy high. And then the kind of lesser intended or lesser direct consequences that you just mentioned are really in the favor of the provider as well. And I ask all our listeners to find any other scenario where providers are winning at this rate to this extent, to those amounts, and getting these positive benefits outside of you. Hey, drinks on me. If you could tell me another scenario where that's happening, but I'm gonna try and do the impossible here, Adam, and then maybe one more question, then parting advice. All right, so I took a bunch of notes to try and recap this. So let's see if we can do it. The NSA IDR process. So it starts with what account actually qualifies, and that you're going to look a little bit more deeply into, is your state federal or is it bifurcated? And then if it's bifurcated, is the plan that you're working with, the patient that you're working with, self-funded or fully funded? And then from there, you're going to do your normal denial and appeal dance. And then if at the end of that, you're still unhappy with the payment, you have 30 days for open negotiations with the payer. If you can't come to terms within those 30 days, where the payer then has a chance to respond, you'll get a whopping 4 days to submit your formal IDR. And that arbitration process, I mean, that's where you said that's incredibly time consuming. Think of any other arbitration anywhere else. Immediately, what probably comes to mind is like lawyers, right? And time and resources and money. So it's not surprising that that's a highly sophisticated and demanding part of the process. Then from there, once you've submitted, you're going to select an IDRE. So you basically your auditor, your independent third party arbitrator. That's a process in and of itself where IDREs basically have their own rules. So you're going to want to
say they have their interpretations of the rules are different.
Better said, yes. In the same way that you mentioned, kind of a judge before might interpret some rules a little bit differently, or evidence,
Yeah.
so to speak, a little bit differently. Then, when the IDR is actually assigned, the auditor from that IDR might request additional documentation, and then finally they make a determination, and whatever that amount that is determined and agreed upon is legally binding, and the payer then has, generally speaking, 30 days to pay. So, holy cow. And that is an ongoing process with each of those qualifying accounts to, again, what we're showing to be incredibly high win rates for material amounts of money that also have these other positive benefits for providers.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like I said, it's a small population. We always get that feedback of like, I'm only getting, $5 million of cash on my out of network populations. And our feedback is, what if we could convert that into 15 million? Because the statistics would say that that's a feasible option.
You teed me up for my last question there. So, for advice for any of the organizations that maybe want to try and measure their opportunity in this space, or even go live with their own solution, what would you tell them?
Yeah. So from an evaluation perspective, if you look on the CMS website within the No Surprises Act, there's a list of RAR codes that an organization can pull or use as a criteria to pull information to understand what the total available population or annual volume would be. The second piece, what I would say is take a look at what you're getting paid as a percentage of charge on that population. And like I said, probably half of that population is going to get being paid 60, 70, 100% of bill charges. That's not the population you want to go after. It's really the percentage that's paying extraordinarily low. And then from there, say it is 15% of charges, go take a look at your Blue Cross contracts, go take a look at your United PPO in-network contracts for an equivalent service, and figure out what you should have been paid or what's modeled to be paid under those contracts. And so that's really where you can start understanding what the delta is between what was paid and what the possibility of payment should or could be. But that's really a good way for folks to understand, hey, what is the opportunity potential for my organization? So I think that's kind of first step. Second step, because it is such a time-boxed process, and because there's inflows and outflows and everything's controlled by certain time restrictions, you really need to have a good tracking mechanism. Epic's not really good at doing that. EMRs are not built for those types of structures. So having a tracking mechanism that allows, alerts of, hey, this account's about to go past its timeliness for open negotiation or timeliness for IDR submission. So having a good workflow process, and then also finding the resources to be able to manage it. Because as I said before, once you get to the IDR arbitration preparation step, that is time intensive. And so you do need a dedicated person or people or a team that is exclusively focused on this particular objective. Because if you don't have all of those things kind of working in concert, there's a good chance you're going to miss out on opportunities. You're going to lose at a high rate. As a good example, we talked to a client that they started this process internally and they went 0 for 144. And so they just stopped. And so we came in and we started working. We were winning close to 100% of the time. And it was because we had the technology that allows us to manage the workflow. We had the automation that allows us to do the process at scale. And then we had a services team that really understood how the IDR and IDREs work. So we were able to work to successfully basically turn a program that they thought wasn't going to generate anything for them internally to a program that's successful and is generating cash for them by working with us to build that process for their organization.
Yeah, and if you're going to do it, I would just add on, go talk to the IDREs. They will tell you, at least it's my understanding, right? They'll guide you on how to be successful, or at least what they need to see.
Yep.
For you to win. It kind of give you the rules and regulations. But, this all started with what are the most overlooked opportunities right now. And again, it has nothing to do with organizations failing. It is that they are too busy juggling too many things at once that these things tend to get overlooked, understandably so, given how challenging they are, the technology you need to be truly successful with them, and the dedicated resources, which is usually the true limitation.
Yeah.
But
For sure.
I think we put a bow on IDR here, and let's jump to my favorite part, final parting advice. Adam, what do you want to leave with our listeners?
Yeah. Just based on kind of what we talked about today, there's a lot of, like I said at the top, there's overlooked areas, and that's not meant to be a punitive statement to any organization. Just like anything, if you're going to look at where most of your revenue is coming from, it's not coming from these areas, right? But I would encourage everybody to at least evaluate or talk to somebody that is highly aware of these processes to give them a sense of magnitude and perspective on what the return could be. Because as I stated, IDR, for example, on a per encounter basis is probably the single largest revenue improvement opportunity that has a high success rate that unfortunately most providers in the acute care setting just aren't evaluating right now. Or if they are, they're very kind of in the nascent stages of it. I've always been a proponent of being a good member of the community. And so I like to spend a lot of my time doing education sessions similar to these podcasts. But if, any of your listeners are interested in understanding more just from an education perspective, whether they decide to go forward or not, we're always open to providing that because like I said, we want to be good members and pillars of the community and ultimately help providers improve their margins.
Well, I thank you for that, Adam. I think it's so important. We're in this together on the provider side, right? It's not a zero-sum game. And that's what this podcast is all about, is education and advice. And I think you've given tons of that today.
Hopefully.
I think so. I know I learned. So, and we've talked, I learned more today. So I appreciate your time, Adam. Best of luck in bringing these things to market more and more. I think they're really a big lift for a lot of organizations. So
yeah, and I appreciate your the invite to be on here, and hopefully we'll be able to do this again sometime soon.
Absolutely, man. Until next time.
All right, have a good one.
That's a wrap on yet another episode of Vendor Voices. Huge thanks to our guests for their insights and to you for listening. If this episode gave you something to think about, share it with your team. If you'd like to suggest a specific topic or guest, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or at rdowns@realpartnersconsulting.com. Please rate and review, and be sure to subscribe to never miss an episode. I'm Ryan Downs. Thanks for tuning in.